France, like most nations, of course employed foreign mercenaries, but France also had some units that were made up almost entirely of foreign recruits, like the Irish Brigade, the Scots Guards and the Swiss Guards. Well, the Scots Guards did eventually allow French people in, but from their creation in the Hundred Years' War they served as the King's bodyguard and kept many of their Scottish traditions until the French Revolution. Anyway, after the French Revolution these units were disbanded, but when the monarchy was restored, the Scots Guards and the Swiss Guards were brought back, albeit a lot weaker, and they were also joined by another foreign regiment, the Hohenlohe Regiment. This regiment, the Hohenlohe Regiment, was made up of all sorts of nationalities, and that's because during the Napoleonic Wars a lot of different nationalities fought for France, like the Poles, the Swiss, the Germans, etc. And this regiment was made out of recruits who were still wanting to serve France, and they saw action in Spain in the 1820s, but the 1830 revolution ended all this. This revolution saw Charles X and his legitimist faction overthrown by the Orleanist faction, who wanted a constitutional monarchy. The Orleanist faction then put Charles's cousin Louis-Philippe on the throne, and with their new constitution they banned foreign mercenaries on French soil. However, this came at a pretty bad time because the new government had just invaded Algeria and were in desperate need of men, so they created the French Foreign Legion, and initially the battalions were based around nationality. So you had an Italian one, a Dutch one, a Belgian one, I think a couple, German, a Swiss one and a Polish one, that sort of thing. But initially they were poorly equipped and undertrained, and they suffered heavy casualties, especially during the Carlist Wars in Spain. Now, the French Foreign Legion also had another benefit. After the Napoleonic Wars, many foreigners were left unemployed on the streets of Paris, so this helped alleviate that problem in a way. However, French people were banned from joining because they didn't want local government officials to send their poor into the Foreign Legion. However, there was nothing to stop a Frenchman saying that he was Swiss or Belgian or something like that. After their initial defeats, the Legion reorganized and battalions were no longer based on nationality, and they went on to gain fame in Indochina, Mexico, Algeria, etc. However, by the end of the 19th century, most of the recruits came from the same countries. In 1896, 26% of the recruits were from Alsace-Lorraine, then part of Germany. 25% were German, 17% were Belgian, 10% were Swiss, 7.5% were Austrian, and the rest were a small mix of Russian, American, British, etc. Fast forward to World War I, and Germans and Austrians were still in the Legion. However, many of them were posted to North Africa just in case they decided to swap sides. However, reports indicate that the Legion was in a pretty chaotic state at the time. This is because thousands of new recruits joined the Legion at the beginning of World War I, and they came from Spain, Switzerland, America, Poland, etc. And so too did a lot of French people with foreign-sounding names because they looked to avoid persecution in the streets of France. Sorry, the light just went out there. But to give you some numbers, it is said that in 1913, just before World War I, about 20% of the Legion were German, and many more came from Alsace-Lorraine. But they didn't seem to cause too much trouble during World War I. However, World War II proved to be a little bit different, well, could have been a lot different. Initially, during the interwar years, the Legion was made up of a lot of people fleeing from totalitarian governments, so there were many Spanish people there, Jews from Germany, etc. But about 80% of the Legion's NCOs were German, and many of them were sent by the Nazis. So the Legion politically was incredibly divided because you had Nazis, essentially, and people who had fled totalitarian governments. So when the Nazis invaded France during World War II, the Legion split, with some legionnaires going to fight for Vichy France while the others fought for Free France. So legionnaires could have essentially been fighting each other. But after World War II, the Legion was of course still open for German recruits, and many former Nazis ran to go join. These legionnaires after World War II were sent to go fight in Indochina and the likes. But the German influence in the Legion can still be heard today. If you listen to Legionnaire songs like Le Legion Marche vers la Front, you'll notice it sounds a hell of a lot like an SS song. And if you're interested, today the nationalities that make up the Legion has completely changed. Well, French still make up about 25% of the new recruits, but Eastern Europeans and South Americans make up a large chunk of it. And there's also 10% of the new recruits are Asian, 7% are African, and 4% are Arab.